So my name is Deanna. I work with community schools in the Albuquerque-Bernalillo County geographic area. Some of you may hopefully be familiar with the community schools network here that is made up of both traditional schools within Albuquerque Public Schools and charter schools. Those all fall within our network. And when I initially started talking to Martha about this topic of housing needs for students who are connected to higher education, we realized that there really isn't a lot of support out there for those particular students. And my specialty and focus area is more on K to 12. And I have conducted some research and published a little bit about these connections between housing stability and educational outcomes for students in New Mexico. So I'm going to just kind of walk you through the things that I have discovered, and we can explore those together. But that being said, I did want to encourage everybody on the call today to really, as we're going through this together, consider what role do you play, or does your organization play as an asset and as a resource in the community for students that are connected to higher education in some capacity. And that would include the University of New Mexico, which does provide housing for students. And so where does our obligation as community assets and resources kind of start and end is just the question that I'd like to put forward to all of you as we explore this. There's a lot of text in my slides, which is not how I normally do it, but I wanted to kind of give some background just on basic rights around housing and education. And so again, I'm not going to read all of this, and Martha has this, so if you really want to go back and read it, feel free to. But you hopefully know that there is a UN Convention on the Rights of the Child that has not been ratified by the United States of America. And housing rights are mentioned in this UN convention. And I underlined that part right here, that the child has a right to a standard of living that is adequate for their physical, mental, spiritual, moral, and social development. And that, as I said, has not been ratified in our country. And so that's just, again, something to think about if you are in a position to encourage some kind of legislation or ratification or ordinance or whatever, wherever you live or whatever area you work in. Is there something that we can talk about around making sure that students and children have access to adequate housing as a right? In addition to that, the right to housing is not recognized in our country. It's not part of the Constitution. It's not really in any state right that I am aware of. And so it's something that it's a little bit surprising when you think about it from a policy perspective. Something that seems so very basic and important to a quality of life, and especially to educational outcomes, is not considered to be a right at this time in our country or in our state. And then just connecting that to education, and again, I'm talking mostly K-12 education. That's where my specialty lies. But there is a recognized right to education in the UN Convention, but there has not been a recognized federal right to education in our country. That being said, almost every single state in the country does have an education clause in their constitution, including New Mexico. And that education clause, as you probably are aware, was the basis for the filing of the consolidated lawsuits of Yessi Martinez versus the state of New Mexico in 2018. The decision, the judge's judgment and order really called up this concept of a right to education, a sufficient education for students in New Mexico. And so what I started really thinking about is, how do we, when we start looking at data around, I was focused specifically in Albuquerque because that's where I am housed. I work for Bernalillo County. And so I was really just looking at census tracts in Albuquerque. I started doing this around 2016, 2017, just kind of examining what is the picture around housing and eviction in our city? And unsurprisingly to most of us, I discovered, and with some help from some professors at the law school, that there are some areas of our city that experience really high rates of eviction. And the data tends to show that those areas of our city are very high minority occupants, very high number of renters in those spaces, low median income, and very high eviction filings, and then high eviction rates. So in this particular census tract that's outlined here in hot pink, this is in the International District, part of Albuquerque. And so because I work with schools, I wanted to know, well, does this census tract data have any impact on schools? And so I started looking at the middle school that falls within that census tract. And the one I looked at, well, there were two, but the one that's shown here is Van Buren Middle School. And I also spoke to teachers at Emerson Elementary School. And I learned that the student mobility rates, meaning a student that either leaves the school year, so like leaves that school, like not leave, like what am I trying to say? Like they disenroll from that school sometime during the school year, or they enroll in that school sometime during the school year. So they don't start and end the year at the school. They're moving in or out. At Emerson Elementary, there was a kindergarten teacher that I spoke to who told me, I have 5 kindergarten students that have completed and ended the year with me. 5. The mobility rate at Emerson, this would have been 2016, was around 91%, meaning 91% of the students were not starting and ending the school year there. You can see Van Buren's mobility rates here have increased almost every year, at least according to these data. I recognize that these are some old data, but I didn't have the new census data at the time when I put this together. But these data show 70% of the students in Van Buren are also highly mobile. Now, if you put yourself into the kind of the mindset of an educator in one of these schools, how exactly, how disruptive do you think it is to the classroom when the majority of your students are leaving all the time? You have new students coming in constantly, students that are leaving constantly. And then imagine from the perspective of the student, they have now lost their peer group. They've lost a trusted relationship potentially with a teacher. Moves that are disruptive for any reason are very damaging to the educational process, just from a consistency standpoint, right? But then there's other trauma that comes along with potentially with eviction in particular. And so this was very concerning for us to see this connection between communities that have a low economic income and very high student mobility and very high rates of eviction. And we started looking into these connections. In addition to that, the New Mexico Public Education Department defines at-risk student, and this is how it is defined in the PED, as students who are Native American, students with disabilities, students who are English language learners, students who are economically disadvantaged, and students who are highly mobile. And that last category was excluded from the lawsuit, which I personally found slightly problematic, because I feel like that is a huge issue that was not addressed and now will not be addressed because it was left out. But the official definition of an at-risk student from the Public Education Department does include that highly mobile category. So a couple more things I want to show you here. These are the proficiency rates in math and English language arts for Van Buren during the same years that we were looking at those student mobility rates. This is in percentage. So you can see that less than 5% of 6th grade students were proficient in math in 2017 and 2019. In English language arts, it drops down even lower in 8th grade. And so we started to draw these connections between academic proficiency, high rates of student mobility, and high rates of evictions in these neighborhoods. And the Legislative Finance Committee also in 2017 conducted a study of the number of moves experienced by a student and the academic outcomes and proficiency that they saw. And you can see in this graph that the more times a student moved, the lower their academic proficiency became. And so the Legislative Finance Committee also recommended that the state take some kind of action to stabilize the housing situations of these highly mobile students, because it is clearly impacting education. And I would, guess, I haven't done any research on this, but I would guess that a high school student who struggles with mobility and unstable housing and is low proficiency, according to this graph, probably has a really difficult time going into higher education and knowing how to maintain stable housing, or knowing how to even find that, and also how do they manage to keep up their academic proficiency, or even to catch up when they have fallen so far behind, honestly, through no fault of their own, right? Like, students are not getting evicted. This is happening to them and happening to their families for a variety of reasons, right? And it's having a massive negative impact on them and their educational outcomes, which, if you expand that impact out to just our economy at large, really impacts all of us. It impacts our communities. Here are some other things around the impact of eviction. It creates this domino effect. And I used the state departments here, but really this could be any kind of bureaucracy where this affects multiple areas, right? This is not just a housing problem. This impacts mental health. This impacts stress. It impacts physical health. It definitely impacts literacy and economic skills. There are studies particularly around mothers who experience eviction and the hardship and the depression, and it can take years for them to overcome the effects that this has on them, just from a personal perspective, and the trauma that they experience in going through this. Not to mention that no one gets evicted into better housing. And so often folks that are at risk and living on the edge like this end up becoming homeless, or they're living in transitional housing like hotels. And that does impact students that are in higher education. I was telling Martha that I worked last year with a senior at UNM on a project, and all of a sudden she just stopped showing up to meetings and stopped returning phone calls and emails, and I don't know what happened to her. And about a month and a half later, she she called me and she said, "I'm so sorry, I was evicted. And I was trying to find another place to live, and it's finals, and it's just been super stressful." And I was kind of shocked. I couldn't believe that, a university student would be facing eviction. They are students. I was shocked. And so it really made me think, what role do we have to play in how to disrupt these things that happen to families, to students, including students in higher learning. And then I'm just going to wrap up by saying, my belief is that our state does have a duty to remedy the harm that is brought about by some of our, and I know that Professor Freedman is going to talk a little bit more about housing law and policy in New Mexico, but I do think there are some things that our state could do, and even our cities or our counties, around passing legislation, protecting students' right to housing when they're in their academic career from K all the way up to university graduation. I think that is really important. I do think that eviction diversion programs, other mediations or other resolutions, especially in cases of non-payment of rent, would really help families it's more difficult to find housing when you have been evicted. So if we could prevent that from happening in the first place, that would help them remain in stable housing, ideally. And I think, again, Professor Freedman might be talking about this later, and I have lots of other ideas. These were just three. But sealing eviction court records in certain cases so that landlords can't tell folks, no, I'm not going to rent to you because you have an eviction, which really is discriminatory, but very damaging. And as I've just said, really has a very detrimental impact on students and on education. And all of us here care about education, clearly. And so all of us should be digging into our resources and our connections to say, what can we bring to the table to really address this issue? Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Deanna. Could we please express our appreciation for her, whether with the emojis or if you're on screen clapping? Such a wealth of information. I appreciated those statistics that you shared from your research. I'm curious, could you share with the group a little bit about the supports that the ABC Community Partnership provides for housing for K through 12 students?
Of course, yes, that would have been a very important thing to include. Thank you for that reminder. So there's a few things. So community schools are a strategy that engages the community assets to address barriers to learning, really, not just learning, but what we want is for our students to thrive. We want our students to thrive in safe environments and in economically developed and stable communities. And so what we try to do is look at what might those barriers be. And housing has come up and came up, especially starting in the spring of 2020, as a massive issue for students who were moving around and being evicted and living in hotels. And so ABC has done a few things. We work very, very closely with Albuquerque Public Schools Title I McKinney-Vento social workers to, so McKinney-Vento is a federal law that provides resources to students who are homeless according to their definition. It's wonderful what they do. It's unfortunate that it exists. There are probably 3,500 or more students in APS that qualify. What I wish is that the resources could be pushed further upstream so that students could access help before they officially became homeless. Because what that means is now they've lost their stable housing, and it's, as I said, much more difficult for them to get into a new place. Obviously, the availability of affordable housing for these families is just like, if you've been listening to any of the news, we just know that that's a massive problem, and that we should have been addressing this issue many years ago, but it was really exacerbated, right, by the COVID pandemic. The other thing that happened is I was talking to a professor at the law school who's not here right now, but about this problem of finding housing resources that are immediate, like emergency housing assistance. Even the ERAP funding, right, that came from the federal government to the state, millions and millions of dollars of assistance for families experiencing, and students who, well, anybody experiencing housing instability and facing eviction, was great, but it took a really long time. And it was a little cumbersome for some people to access. And there was a story, I'll tell this real quick story, where I got a call from a school. There was a mother with her two daughters, both disabled, who were living in their van. And the teacher had noticed that they were, not housed, and had called me and wanted to know like what we could do. Now, the interesting part of the story is the family had a housing voucher. They even had an apartment, but they couldn't move in yet because it wasn't ready. It hadn't been inspected by the housing authority, and they had another week to go, but their lease had expired and they had nowhere to go. And it was cold, it was February. And my first thought was, all right, let's just get them out of their van, and then I'll connect them up to the school, and we'll find other resources for them. But first we need to get them in a place. And I called several places and I could not find anybody that could put them in a hotel like right now tonight. No, nobody. I mean, lots of people wanted to, and there were resources, but they just couldn't do it immediately. And so he and I ended up starting our own nonprofit that we call Amparo, that works solely with schools that have, families that have school-aged children who are in these kinds of situations that need immediate assistance before they can access additional resources that are out there, which there's quite a lot of housing resources for folks in our city and county, but they're not necessarily immediately available. And since we started that 3 years ago, we have helped hundreds. Just last year, it was about 330 students that we were able to keep at least in some kind of housing. So the Community School Network works with that organization. They work very closely. I see Judy is here with East Central Ministries. And we do our best to also connect, like we look at a network level. Sometimes we'll connect them with New Mexico Legal Aid if there is a question around the legality of their eviction process. We've connected folks to the law school, to the Economic Justice Clinic for housing assistance. We've connected them to Pegasus Legal Services if they need help with other things like custody or kinship guardianship. And so we recognize again that housing is like a basic fundamental issue, but there are often lots of other things that get piled on top of that. And so really understanding how systems can interact together for a stronger network and having one access point at the school is what we have found to be the most successful in the community that we help in particular. I hope that answered the question, Martha.
Thank you. Yes, that's very important. And I really appreciate the work that you do. Thank you for that. If you wouldn't mind, in the name of time, sharing your contact information in the chat if folks have additional questions. Also, yeah, you put it in the chat, the name of the nonprofit, Amparo. That's great. And I'm going to go ahead and pin Allison, and you're also welcome to share your screen. And welcome to the space. We're really glad to have you. It's wonderful.
Thank you so much. And yeah, thank you for organizing this, Martha and Deanna. That was such helpful information and background. And so I am going to talk a little bit about a little bit of the nitty gritty in terms of the eviction process and how it works. I think this is important just to understand, what it is that a student or their family might be going through when we say, okay, this family is being evicted. What does that look like? And what are some of the things that you can look out for in terms of, how to help students, where they might be in the process, all of that. So I might be getting into the nitty gritty. By no means do you need to, remember all of the nitty gritty, but I think it's just helpful to kind of have the background in your mind so that, if you want to connect to resources or connect students to resources, you might know kind of where they're at in the process. I should say that I work at the UNM School of Law and I work in the Economic Justice Clinic. I work with law students on live cases, a lot of housing cases. So we represent tenants in landlord-tenant court who are going through the eviction process. And we work with a lot of the community partners that Deanna mentioned. So, Legal Aid, the New Mexico Center on Poverty, and some other nonprofits to try to keep individuals housed. So obviously I have to say this isn't legal advice. I think you all know that, but just to put it out there. So I'll start with the eviction process, and then I'll talk about some other common housing issues that come up so that you're aware of sort of individuals' rights there. Some of the challenges of New Mexico housing law that Deanna also kind of mentioned in terms of eviction ceiling and things, and then provide some resources at the end. So the eviction process, like Deanna, I have a lot of text on these slides, but don't feel like you need to read it. And again, if you want to access the slides afterward, I'm happy to provide them to Martha so that you can take a look at it more closely. But the main law that governs landlord-tenant relationships is called the Uniform Owner Resident Relations Act, or URA, which I'll call it today for short. It's quite a mouthful. Some other states call it things like the Landlord-Tenant Act, so you can just kind of remember it by that. This is a law that governs all relationships between landlords and tenants, except in certain circumstances, which are provided here on this slide. The most relevant one is probably college dorms. But for the most part, this is the law we're talking about when we're talking about the eviction process. Another kind of confusing thing is that eviction is also called restitution in New Mexico. So when I say the word restitution, I'm just talking about the eviction process. So to kick off an eviction, a landlord must always provide a written notice. It's called a pre-termination notice. And so that has to be provided for an individual to have to vacate the property. Sometimes there's actually a period to cure, and I'll talk about what that means in a moment. And there are 4 types of these particular notices that individuals may receive. So in other words, there's no self-help. So a landlord can't just change the locks on a particular family and particular students. They can't just come in and say, okay, you're kicked out of your apartment. So if you see something like that going on, know that it's not allowed. The eviction process has to start with this pre-termination notice. And there's 4 types of these notices. The most common one is for non-payment of rent. And so, we see this when a tenant is unable to pay their rent or has fallen behind on rent as required by the rental agreement. And the landlord has to provide them with 3 days notice and the right to cure. So in other words, the landlord has to, allow them to pay the back rent back within 3 days. And if the tenant does that, then they get to stay in the home and are not allowed to be evicted. So that's the first type of notice. The second is for material non-compliance. And so this is sort of most non-rent related violations. So things like noise disturbances or unauthorized occupants or damages to a unit. And in this case, the landlord has to provide 7 days notice and provide some pretty specific information about why a family is being evicted in that particular case. Again, there's a right to cure here. And so if there was a noise disturbance, for example, and the noise stops, that has been cured and the landlord cannot take those individuals to court. The third is for a substantial violation, and that requires 3 days notice. There's no right to cure, and they're pretty substantial or severe violations. And there are these 7 that are listed on the slide. I won't go through all of them, but it's things related to, controlled substances or use of a deadly weapon or things like that. And then finally, and most surprisingly, I think this is called the end of term notice. So when I started doing this work, I was pretty surprised by the fact that a landlord can just say, okay, I've given you 30 days notice with one of these pre-termination notices. And at the end of that 30 days, the individuals do have to leave the premises if it's a proper reason. So the landlord doesn't have to provide any reason at all. If they just say, I want to sell the property, I'm giving you 30 days and you have to be out, that is actually legal. However, you can't do that for a discriminatory reason. So you can't, say, oh, because of race, national origin, age, things like that, I'm evicting you. So there are sort of limitations to that. Other sort of important details about these notices is that the owner has to wait until that period, that 7 days or that 3 days expires before they take an individual to court. And so again, it's not an immediate thing. The landlord can't just come and change the locks. They have to wait this proper period of time to comply with the law to actually start an eviction lawsuit. So a lot of times we see, cases where the landlord has not waited for that period of time and then is still bringing individuals to court, and that's not proper. And so the judge should actually dismiss the case. Deanna mentioned something called the Emergency Rental Assistance Program, and so I just wanted to spend a few minutes on that. This applies to those non-payment of rent cases, and this has been something that I think is really instrumental to keeping individuals in New Mexico housed. This was initially done with federal funds, and Nicholas maybe going to talk about this in a moment, I'm not sure. But essentially it helps bring parties together. So the landlord and the tenant, if they are in court, are kind of put into a room together. If they both agree to the program, then federal funds and now to some extent, hopefully state funds will be provided for the back rent that is owed in most cases. And that has really helped a lot of individuals to stay housed. So I think a lot of people, didn't know about this at the beginning of the pandemic, and still I find that a lot of clients don't necessarily know about this program. So it's something that I just, like to spread the word about. If, you are working with students who, are being evicted for non-payment of rent, this is a program that has been really instrumental in terms of keeping individuals housed. And so it's something to just be aware of and have on your radar. Once that pre-termination notice has been provided, the way that the case progresses is that if the tenant loses in court, so let's say they had an unauthorized occupant in the home and the landlord proves that that is the case and it was a violation of the lease, then the judge issues a judgment, and then essentially the tenant has between 3 and 7 days to move out, kind of depending on the timing of the court case. So that's the basic eviction process. And again, I just provide that so that, I think it's helpful for everyone to know just what it is that students are facing when we say, like, this is what's happening in the eviction process. It can happen really, really quickly, unlike other lawsuits. There's a special court, I call it eviction court, unfortunately, where individuals go for these specific types of cases and they move on what's called a rocket docket or extremely quickly. So it's not like other cases that, can take months or years. This can happen overnight. As Deanna mentioned, she had a student she was working with, and then all of a sudden the next day they weren't responding, and that's because the process does really happen so quickly. So other kind of common housing issues that come up, repairs, I won't spend a ton of time on this, but, just know that is recourse if students' houses are not being repaired. So, if a tenant gives written notice, and that can include an email or a text, a landlord has 7 days to make those repairs. Otherwise, the tenant can withhold some of the rent for that. So there is recourse for things, if the home is not habitable, which we see, a lot of, unfortunately, and students just living in homes that are in disrepair and that are really kind of making it very difficult to be just students and children in those homes. Same thing with right of entry. Landlords can't just come into a home. They have to give 24 hours notice in most cases, and kind of a reasonable time to come and fix things. So again, there's kind of rights there. Domestic violence is something that comes up quite a bit and is something, that I think is also important to be aware of. If students are in subsidized housing, there's something called the Violence Against Women Act that, bars eviction and bars the termination of a housing choice voucher or a subsidy for victims who are in a domestic abuse situation. So again, it's important to kind of be aware that if that's something that, you might be aware of that a student is facing, there is some recourse for that too, if the eviction is related to domestic violence. The Fair Housing Act, like I mentioned, evictions cannot happen for a discriminatory purpose. So the Fair Housing Act protects individuals on the basis of race and gender, national origin, disability, things like that. And that applies to owners who have 4 or more units. And so again, these are things just to kind of put on your radar. And then I always just like to mention damage deposits, because I know a lot of the cases that we see, when we go and put down a damage deposit or a security deposit for an apartment, when an individual is moving out of the apartment, oftentimes they're expecting to get that damage deposit back, which then helps them to put that deposit down on a new home. As Deanna mentioned, that can be really crucial for helping individuals to move quickly into a home. And so if you're not getting the damage deposit back, that can slow down the process, among many other things that can slow down the process in getting someone housed quickly. So you can, file a lawsuit to get that money returned. That does take a little while, but oftentimes in the long run, that does help families to recover that money. This is just a slide about advice for departing tenants. So, if you are working with students or individuals who are, in the situation where they are being evicted, obviously, that's not the place we want to be, but I think it's helpful just to let individuals know to have, documents and meds and baby supplies and clothing and things packed up if they're in that particular situation. And if an individual is moving, it's really important just to try to do, a walkthrough and take photographs and have witnesses, so that, if there is legal recourse down the line, it's helpful if there's evidence. I realize this is not always practical. Sometimes that's not going to happen, but, if you're helping an individual and providing sort of, best practices, and there is the time to do that, I think it's helpful just to remind people of that as well. So I'll also just take a couple of minutes to highlight some of the challenges of New Mexico housing law and things that we in the Economic Justice Clinic and with other individuals as well have been working on. And I think I'll start with the one at the bottom that Deanna mentioned. Right now, there isn't an ability to expunge evictions or seal them. In other words, if an individual has an eviction on their record, it can really be detrimental in the sense that it's very hard for individuals to find housing after having an expungement on their record. And so that's something that, we're working on at a local level and a state level and potentially the federal level to try to, remedy that situation and seal those evictions so that it's easier for individuals to have future housing. And then finally, I just wanted to end with a few resources. So, if you have students or individuals who need legal help, and obviously that's not always the answer, but if sometimes that is the answer, the University of New Mexico Law School has legal clinics. Like I said, I work in the Economic Justice Clinic, and so we represent tenants who are facing evictions. The UNM School of Law is also starting a Center for Housing Law. As I said, this is coming. So I'm working with a few other professors here to start that center, and that will house some other resources for individuals who are facing eviction. Legal aid is a great resource for low-income individuals facing evictions. I put Amparo on here, which Deanna obviously already talked about, and is a wonderful resource. And then for individuals who do find themselves to be homeless, Albuquerque Healthcare for the Homeless has really amazing resources for, in terms of shelter and food and healthcare and things like that for individuals who might find themselves in that situation. So those are just a few of the many resources that New Mexico has to offer. So I will stop sharing there and open it up if people have questions.
Thank you so much, Allison. I appreciate that wealth of information. Could we show our appreciation for Allison, whether through emojis or clapping? Thank you. And it looks like RG has a question in the chat. She says, how secure are your privacy records?
Would you mind just elaborating on that a little bit in terms of what kind of records you mean?
Yeah, RG, do you want to come off mute and ask your question?
Yes, I'm asking about anonymous cases. Do you share cases with names, or do you have, I guess, to protect the privacy of the cases you see?
Oh, certainly. Yeah, no. So there's an attorney-client privilege. And so anything that an individual comes to me and shares is protected by that privilege. And so I wouldn't share the names or any details of any particular cases without the permission of that individual. And even particularly with cases involving children or students, I would never share that, generally, even with permission, unless it's something that they have explicitly told me that they would really want shared for some reason.
Thank you. Any other questions for Allison?
I see something in the chat from Jim, and sorry, I'm just
yeah,
great.
This is Jim. I was just like, have you produced anything like a short YouTube on presenting this kind of information? Because my sense is, I'll tell students to talk to legal aid or something, but for them, that's like a really big step in trying to pursue something, rather than, if I could just say, well, here's a link, here's a YouTube that is about the housing regulations in Albuquerque that they could really relate with, and at least get a sense whether they can speak with legal aid or something. But I would think that if you had something like that I could just point them to, it would be really helpful. I don't know if you've created anything like that, any resources.
Yeah, no, that's an absolutely fantastic idea. So I actually moved back here. I grew up in Albuquerque. I moved back here about a year ago, but I was previously working at the University of Michigan Law School. And while I was there working in the clinics, we produced a video even that was very similar to what you said, and that also had a tour of the courtroom, just to sort of like bring down the barriers and help individuals and students who might have to go into a courtroom just to feel like, okay, here's what it's going to be like, here's what it's going to look like, here's what the process is going to be like. So we haven't done something like that in New Mexico, but it's definitely on my radar, and I love the idea. I think it's a great one. So and something my clinic students would, I think, really benefit from working on as well. So I will take that back to my clinic. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. And if you feel comfortable and want to share your contact information, you're welcome to put that in the chat. And I'm going to go ahead and welcome Nick to the stage, and I will pin your video. You're welcome to share screen if you would like to. Tell us a little bit about yourself, Nick, and go ahead and share your expertise. Thank you for joining.
Sure. Hi, everybody. And thank you, Martha, for the invitation to join and share a little bit today about the federal office and the office of Senator Ben Ray Lujan, and how our office can help organizations and individuals navigate some of these challenging situations. We work, and I'll show a little bit of a slide deck just of some overarching resources that we provide to our constituents. But we're able to help individuals with cases that they have or situations that they have or issues in regards to federal agencies across the board. So it could be higher education, it could be housing, getting subsidized vouchers and resources. We can't get them vouchers. We don't have vouchers to hand out, but we're able to navigate the federal agencies to identify resources to connect folks with those resources. So thanks again for having me here, and I hope that this information is helpful to the group, and I appreciate the presenters, and I'm anxious to see what Amy is able to share from the state's perspective, because I think there's going to be some federal level kind of overarching things, and then there's going to be some state level where there's some resources that are available to local entities. So give me one sec here while I pull up the share screen. All right. So you should be able to see my screen right now, and I have the slide deck on. If you give me a thumbs up and let me know that it's there. All right, perfect. So just a little bit about our office. I work for the office of Senator Ben Ray Lujan. Ben Ray Lujan's from New Mexico and is the elected senator for the state of New Mexico, and covers communities across the entire state. Prior to that, he was in the House of Representatives, and so I worked with him on that on that side, and also covered Congressional District 3, which is northern New Mexico. So I had rural counties in northern New Mexico that I covered for him. So there's just a little bit of information about him. What we do in our office is we have different positions from here in New Mexico, and then my colleagues in Washington, D.C. Work on legislative priorities that impact New Mexico and New Mexicans. And so my job here in the state is to work with local communities and community members and governments to identify how funding and how resources are being implemented into New Mexico from national policy. And so when there's challenges and when there's issues from the national, from Congress and the implementation at the local level here in New Mexico, because New Mexico's so unique, there are avenues that I'm able to educate my counterparts in DC so that they can go and network with other members of Congress to let them know how those laws and policies impact New Mexicans and our constituents here at home. So our office is able to help, like I mentioned, help navigate federal agencies and situations that an individual has. So we work with the Department of Housing and Urban Development, the Veterans Administration, Social Security Administration, public lands offices, so the Department of Interior or the Department of Agriculture, just with different issues that may be impacting individuals. So federal programs, like I mentioned, SNAP benefits, for example, is something that's implemented at the state level, but it's funded on a national level. And so, the policies and the rules and the regulations are federal. And so hearing from individual constituents and seeing how those laws or rules impact New Mexicans is helpful for us so that we can make sure that these laws are favorable to New Mexicans and be able to help local folks. So in a little bit of a side note, our office also helps with federal grant searches. Many of you, it sounds like, are from organizations that have federal grants or are funded through philanthropic organizations or through other funding sources. And so our office it works together with a delegation to identify federal funding opportunities through federal grants, that we can try and bring those funds back to New Mexico and help make New Mexico organizations and entities more competitive on a national level. So however we can help with grant searches. And then if you apply for a federal grant, we can also work together as a delegation to write a letter of support to support your application and hopefully identify those funds and get those funds to New Mexico. And then also just another piece is Academy nominations. If folks for high school students that are interested in going to an academy in the US. It requires a letter of support from a congressional representative, and so that's another service that we offer. Through our casework resources, I mentioned some of the agencies that we're able to help with, but any federal angle. And so higher education, one of the things that the senator has done and pushed for is supporting our educators and supporting public servants through loan forgiveness. And so really working to bring some attention to the impact that our public servants have and help eliminate that as a barrier for public servants as they move forward. And so, and then these are just list a couple of other entities and other agencies we're able to work with. Through our casework process, of course, we have to have a privacy release form. I know that was talked a little bit about earlier. Our office, respects the privacy of our constituents. And so when they come to us with an issue, we want to try and navigate that issue and not have any unintended consequences by, publicizing or making causing other issues for those individuals. And then you can always reach out to Allison or some of the folks through the New Mexico Bar Association. We refer legal matters, which is outside of the legislative branch and the judicial branch, to the Bar Association, where you can find an attorney to navigate some of those processes. And if it fits, we're able to recommend legal aid or connect folks with other resources that may be available. Just some of the folks who have given us permission to share their stories. We want to highlight that because it helps make others aware that that's something that our office is able to support individuals with. I talked a little bit about the grants process already. If anybody's interested on this webinar of hearing or receiving grants advisories that the delegation puts together, I'm happy to add you to my list and be able to send information about those grants out. And I'm happy to share it with Martha, and Martha can also forward it too if that's the easiest. And then here's just a little bit of information about how to connect and engage with our office. I'll put my contact information in the chat so that you all have access to it. And there's my contact information as well. But as far as some of the resources that we've been able to provide for individuals is really bringing the right folks to the table. We've worked with housing advocates, we worked with the state, we worked with federal agencies to try and bring attention to this housing issue on a larger scale. And so we know that there were housing issues and challenges prior to COVID, and through COVID, we saw that just the impact of what that is on the communities. Deanna talked a lot about how that impacts school-age children and their abilities to retain information to the next grade, and how that impacts our students' abilities to prepare for a higher education and then into the workforce, and so it just is a snowball effect that impacts our community. And so how do we really support our communities and decrease the negative consequences of not having access to housing? So I'll stop my slides because it's kind of I just wanted to be able to share a little bit about that process. But one of the things that we've been able to do early on in COVID was bring developers to the table, bring the Mexican Mortgage Finance Authority to the table, bring housing agencies and housing nonprofits to the table to have conversations about what resources are out there, what gaps are out there that we can try to fill. Before the CARES Act was passed and before the American Rescue Plan was passed, which Allison talked a little bit about some of the emergency rental assistance funds, there wasn't a whole lot of resources for individuals, and the moratorium tried to keep people housed and keep people in homes to keep them safe and away from the virus and different things. So The federal government and Congress took action to provide resources, and through the Emergency Rental Assistance Program, provided hundreds of millions of dollars to New Mexico to keep rents, to help individuals pay rent who were impacted by COVID and lost income due to COVID. And so in addition to that, utility resources were also made available to renters, and then through the Homeowner Assistance Fund, which is still being rolled out through the New Mexico Mortgage Finance Authority, is also available for individuals. I had a conversation with the New Mexico Mortgage Finance Authority. There's about $17 million still available through their fund to be able to help homeowners with who are in forbearance or are working with their mortgage financer to get back on track. So there's a lot of resources that are still out there. Unfortunately, the emergency rental assistance programs have exhausted their funds at this point earlier this year, and their funding is very limited in how they're able to support individuals right now. It's on an emergency basis, and I'm hoping Amy will talk a little bit about resources that may still be available for folks on the local level moving forward. So those are some of the resources that Congress has been able to generate resources for to share with local entities to help individual renters and homeowners. And so a little bit about just kind of how some of these programs work. There's a Housing and Urban Development Office here in New Mexico. They work closely with some organizations, including the New Mexico Mortgage Finance Authority, the Coalition to End Homelessness, and others to and housing authorities, I guess, also to provide vouchers and subsidized resources for individuals who fit income thresholds and that sort of thing. And so the Mortgage Finance Authority works with developers, and developers are eligible for incentives to develop out housing opportunities for low income and eligible individuals that meet a certain federal criteria. And so, together, what we've seen and we provide the resources, and then on the ground, we really encourage local entities to partner and work together and develop out strategies and plans that can be put forward to help identify housing needs in a community and provide those resources to the community. And so however we can be a resource, and if there are folks that are seeing successes or challenges through those resources, I'm happy to take that information back and see what we can do on a federal level to improve those programs and make sure they make sense for New Mexico and for individual constituents. So that's just a little bit about some of the how to navigate some of those federal resources, and and how it trickles down to the local level individual who's receiving a voucher and looking for housing. We work with constituents frequently, unfortunately, that have vouchers in hand, but they can't identify a place to live because the housing stock in the area, in the region, is very limited. So we try and work with landlords, we try and work with housing authorities to identify opportunities and resources that are in those communities. So if you're running into issues, we're happy to take that information back and see what we can do to help bring folks to the table to have conversations about how to move forward and get more landlords on board, or just resources out there to the community. So I hope that was helpful. I don't want to take up too much time. I think the presentations that were before me were really informative, just about the process and how it impacts school-age children. And I think closing with the state's going to have some really insightful information for us as well. So Martha, I hope that was helpful for you.
Thank you so much, Nicholas. We really appreciate hearing more about the support and resources that the Senator's office can provide to constituents. So thank you for that information. We do have time for a question or two. Does anyone have, yes, also express your thanks, either applause or emojis there. And if anyone has a question.
That must mean I covered everything.
Yes.
So, yeah,
Completely.
great. If anybody has any
People are mulling it
follow-up
over.
questions or information, I'll put my information in the chat as well, so you all can reach out.
Great. Well, thank you again. And we are looking forward to being in touch and continuing to work together. All right. I would like to invite, and I'll switch my pin over. Amy Whitfield, thank you so much for joining us today. We're really happy to have you here in this space. And if you would like to go ahead and introduce yourself, and you're also welcome to share screen as needed.
Hey everyone, thanks so much for the opportunity to share with you. I'll go ahead and share my screen here. And if anyone can let me know if you're not seeing it. So I think today that you know, everyone else has already been so informative. So I really hope that I am not just repetitive and actually can bring something to the conversation. And so what I really want to start with is kind of the question of, are we in a homelessness crisis? We are seeing more and more in our face homelessness. You know, it's happening where we see it in the news all the time. I think there are very few of us who drive to work or from work or just to the grocery store who aren't seeing the problem in our faces through encampments or, you know, the person who is unhoused walking down the street, all of those things. And so it really leads us to this place of, okay, you know, are in a homelessness crisis. And I would say that, yes, we absolutely are in a homelessness crisis. But I also want to say that we have been in a homelessness crisis for about 30 years, that we as the nation, the US nation, really relied on the federal government as the place that would offer affordable housing and make sure that states had affordable housing. And that about 30 years ago, they really slowed down the pace that they were doing that. They slowed down the funding that they were providing for that. And so it has resulted in a homelessness crisis. It's resulted in a huge lack of housing, particularly affordable housing, not just affordable housing, but specifically affordable housing. And so we're now in this place of really trying to think about exactly how do we respond to that? Because the solution for homelessness is housing, and yet housing doesn't get built fast, and putting people into housing doesn't happen fast. And so, as I think the old saying goes, when was the best time to plant a tree? 25 years ago. But you know, we didn't plant one 25 years ago, so we really need to get involved in it today. And so we've seen, you know, HUD, USDA, and other federal organizations, the U.S. Interagency, I think, Council on Housing and Homelessness, have really started, you know, making some efforts, moving things forward. And that here in our state, we have also started moving things forward as well. And so I want to really say that, you know, what we have seen is we've seen the statistics. We know the statistics. We know that there is a lack of housing. We know that there's a lack of affordable housing. We know what homelessness does. How does it impact education? How does it impact health? How does it impact economic development for our state as a whole? We've seen all of those different statistics. And yet where we're at right now is this place of not really knowing why, right? That we have done all that we need to do to figure out exactly what the problem is, and yet we don't really know why we have the problem, other than saying there's not enough housing. But we also know that about 80% of our homelessness problem isn't what you see on the streets, right? It's not the person who has been kicked out of their housing and cannot find their way back in. It's all of those different things that other folks have said, right? It's people who were paying their rent, and then all of a sudden there was an eviction because the landlord wanted to sell a house. or it's people who were paying their rent, but they were paying probably about 40% of their rent, or 40% of their income, or 50% of their income was rent. And then something happened, a car broke down, they needed to buy medicine, you know, someone in the family died and they had to participate in the funeral expenses or things like that. And so then they're not able to pay their rent, and the cycle of paying gets, you know, pushed further and further and further back. And it's other stories of, you know, someone who, you know, finds themselves in a substance abuse problem, and that in order to really get good treatment, they have to go someplace and for a long period of time, meaning that they lose their job and potentially lose their housing. And then when they come back into the community, there isn't really a transitional way for them to get back into housing. And so there's all of those different reasons, but here in New Mexico, we don't have, we know the reasons, but we don't have stats on the reasons. We spend a lot of time figuring out how many people need to be housed, and not how they need to be housed, or where they need to be housed, or what supportive services they need. So I want to talk real generally about available resources. And these are resources that would be available pretty much anywhere in the state. Some states or some locations are going to have less than others, but these are kind of general ones, right? So that if you're looking for something, you can, you know, search your location and this kind of resource, and things will pop up for you. And so I want to run through these, but then I also want to talk about the problems with them also, because, you know, one of the things that we have found is that here in New Mexico, we don't have a lack of infrastructure, right? That if somebody were to say, here's the solution to homelessness, we would probably answer, we have that solution already. It becomes, what are the barriers to getting to that solution? What are the barriers to implementing that solution? What are the changes that are happening across governments, meaning our local governments to our state governments and to our federal governments, but also what's happening across administrations, right? What we do in this administration is going to probably change the very first day of a next administration. And so those are the kind of the reasons why even when we have resources, we're not necessarily solving the problem. And so these are probably things you already know about, but I do want to just kind of go through them very quickly. So we have emergency shelter. You will find many counties in New Mexico who do not have emergency shelter, or you will find that their emergency shelter is merged with a county nearby. And that becomes a huge barrier, that where we have placed our emergency shelters are not necessarily dependent on communities. They're dependent on where nonprofits or whoever or city governments that are running them can run them most easily. They're also really dependent on what we call not in my backyard, right? That anytime there is someone who says we'd like to put up a shelter, there is usually a neighborhood association that's at the meeting that is arguing that it should not be in their neighborhood. And the other thing that we have is that we have done emergency shelters for the convenience of how we run shelters, not for the convenience of how people feel welcomed and housed. And so that we have created shelters kind of in this, as long as you have a bed, you should feel good about it way. And that has really driven people to choose not to be sheltered because and it's not that they're saying, I don't want to go to a shelter. It's what they're saying is, I'm choosing being with my community. I'm choosing being with my family. I'm choosing living in a way that gives me opportunity above living in a shelter that does not do those things. And so we do not have very many shelters in New Mexico that have really been built so that people who are unhoused can continue their lives the way is beneficial for them, because the shelters are really run in a way that tells people you have to leave your neighborhood, leave your community, leave the family that you've created sometimes, leave animals behind, all of those different things that those choices are far too hard for someone to make. The other thing we have is public housing. Here in New Mexico, we actually have a very robust public housing system. You can, if you are someone who needs to help a student, you really can call your local public housing authority. They are folks who can really support students and families in making sure that they're moving out of homelessness. But again, as Deanna said, most of these are not things that can be done on an emergency basis. The other thing that's very common for people who are unhoused or precariously housed is voucher housing. So there are things that are motel vouchers. Many nonprofits will have motel vouchers. Many local governments will have motel vouchers in order to be able to give those out. We also have Section 8 vouchers. That's a federal program that's run through the Housing and Urban Development. It's also going to be run through your public housing authority. And so those are very, very common vouchers that many people use. Here in New Mexico, we have a unique program called Linkages. It is very specific for people who are experiencing substance use disorder or have a serious mental illness. And so that is also a voucher that they can use that is also connected to case management on a monthly basis. And then many local governments here in New Mexico have realized that there are not enough vouchers, and so they will create their own voucher system as well. And one of the things that we have found with the voucher housing is that people can access a voucher. That does not mean they can access a rental apartment, right? That the more demand there is for apartments, the less likely landlords are to use or to accept vouchers. There's also this huge stigma around people who are using vouchers. This idea that many of our landlords, and not just here in New Mexico, throughout all of the nation, many people have created this idea that people who need vouchers are people who are dangerous, people who will ruin their apartments, people who do not contribute to the economy. And all of that is not true. So that's one of the things that is a huge barrier for people in finding rentals that they can use. Rapid rehousing is that prevention factor of someone who is about to lose their housing, either through an eviction process or something else, and that they can seek out support. This is one of those things that when we talk about the emergency rental assistance, this is a rapid rehousing project. As Nicholas shared, the funding for the emergency rental assistance program did run out. We closed the portal down, which means we stopped accepting applications in January, and that the funding just using the existing applications will probably be expended very soon. And so we had to shift that to a much more emergency-based kind of system, so that for folks who were experiencing eviction in that moment, they kind of moved up in the line. But generally speaking, there is not a way to apply for those funds anymore. And even if you do apply for those funds, it's very likely that those funds are not available for you unless you are right there about to be evicted. We did approach the well, I'll save that for the next time. The other thing is that we need permanent supportive housing, right? We need to know what many people will have housing and are not able to stay in housing. And permanent supportive housing is housing that allows folks to come in, get case management and medical treatment and supportive services all at the same location where they live, so that it is much more likely that they do not, we call it blow out of their housing, but there's probably a much better, kinder term that I should start using, right? Here in New Mexico, we have a public health act. Within that public health act, youth have the right to be sheltered. That does not mean families that have youth. It is youth have the right to be sheltered. And so any young person does have the right to be sheltered either through a voucher or through a shelter. We have several different youth shelters that are with CYFD funding, specifically to make sure that we can exercise that right that young people have in the Public Health Act of New Mexico. We also have what is called the Fostering Connections program. This is a program for any young person who was in state custody from the age of 14 or later, has access to Fostering Connections, which is a program that gives them free education, free housing, and free independent living, supportive case management. Another thing that you might want to go to for resources is landlord-tenant negotiations. Allison really already shared the work that they do. Legal aid is also one of the places where you can get that service, and it's a really great thing that keeps people in their houses or in their housing if they can. And then we also have the school-based homeless liaisons. This is part of the McKinney-Vento Act. Every school is required to have a school-based homeless liaison, right? What I will say is the biggest problem of all of this is that it doesn't actually tackle the issue of homelessness. It doesn't tackle the issue of precariously housed. What it does is it expects you to already be in major crisis before you can receive help, right? One of the things that we have found is that the definition of homelessness for most of these programs requires someone to be living on the streets for more than 3 days. And that really limits people being able to avoid that trauma, avoid evictions on their records, and avoid the crime and violence that happens to people who experience homelessness when they do live on the street. And so this is one of the huge problems that we have is you will find many of the people who are trying to be extremely helpful saying things to their clients like, well, could you sleep on the streets tonight so I can help you tomorrow? It becomes a huge problem of who is eligible for these resources. Also, many of these resources are expunged before, the end of the month, right? So you have some organizations that will give out vouchers on a monthly basis. We're going to give out 30 in this month, and all of those vouchers are used up by the 3rd or 4th of the month, right? You also have some organizations that will say we're going to do this on a yearly basis, and they'll use up their vouchers usually before April or May. And so while these resources really do exist and are places where you can send people to, very often what you will get from them is either we don't have any left, or we're only serving this amount, like this group of people, and you have to fit into that eligibility, or you have to be a member of this program. And so you can't really get the assistance unless you sign up for, the larger, bigger program that they have that you may not actually need to be involved in. And so while that's kind of depressing, I'm sorry, let me then move to what exactly are we doing at the state of New Mexico? How are we doing this? So, like I said before, for many years, decades and decades, the nation has really relied on the federal government to be the funding for affordable housing. And because that slowed down so dramatically, our housing that has been built has slowed down so dramatically. And now we're in a situation right now where housing is expensive, demand is expensive, and it is causing not only homelessness, but it's causing so many other issues. And so we're trying to get to the point where we are elevating the issue of housing and homelessness to the state level, really saying the state needs to take a role in this. And, similar to the resources we just talked about, those things can't happen immediately because we don't actually have a structure at the state level to do that. We do have the Mortgage Finance Authority, which is a quasi-government agency. It does not report to the executive, which means it's not within the purview of the governor to say, here's how we want you to run things. And it's not a government agency. And so while we have them, that's not actually a structure for the state to move things forward. So the first thing we're really focusing on is how do we strengthen up New Mexico's communities? Because when you don't have appropriate housing, that really damages communities as a whole. The second thing that we want to focus on is supporting New Mexico's people to thrive in safe and affordable housing. We know that people who are housed have better education outcomes, they have better health outcomes, they have better career outcomes, they just do better when they are housed in safe and affordable housing. And by affordable, we mean 30% of your income. And then we're also going to focus on prevention and responding to homelessness in New Mexico. And so we had a huge legislative opportunity to bring together multiple different stakeholders. And really, when we started looking at, okay, what do we need to do at the state level? All of this is what came up. And so you don't need to really know any of these things. The reason I put it up here is so that you know these are all of the areas that need to be fixed in order for us to really, really tackle the homelessness crisis that we're going through. And it really means that we cannot just say, we're going to do this over here or do this over here. We need a comprehensive strategy, a very comprehensive strategy. And so what we did this legislative session is that we sent in a comprehensive budget asking legislators to please fund things that would move that forward. We really believe that the first priority we need to have is housing development. We need to increase the source of homes. We need to increase the way that people can access homes and rentals. So the first thing we asked for was $20 million so that we could do some housing initiatives and increase development. And so we will work throughout the state to make sure that that $20 million is gap funding for existing plans that have not been able to finish because of price increases or because of lack of other funding. We also have $7 million in what we call a CASA Connections grant. The CASA Connections grant works with local governments to really increase their ability to provide emergency shelter in a way that is something that people want to go to and that they don't have to leave their community behind in order to do that. We also have $10 million to work with local governments. Local governments really experience the brunt of doing housing work, and many of them are in a place where they do not have the capacity to really say, this is what we need in our community, and this is how we can get it. And so we want to work with them. We increased the linkages vouchers program by $1 million. We got $4 million to do a mobile homelessness response. We didn't actually get any money for our students experiencing homelessness, but we will be working with them to see how they can fit into some of these other funding. For the eviction rental assistance program, only received $1 million. For the landlord support program, which really increases landlords who will accept vouchers, we received $2.5 million. And then we passed a bill that allows for the New Mexico Housing Trust Fund to have access to tax bonds 1 year earlier. So that means that $37 million will go into building and development that is organized by the Mortgage Finance Authority, right? So I'm sure many of you are sitting there saying, but I have kids who are homeless right now. What are we supposed to do? And what we really need to do is increase our ability to do development so that we have places for them to go. But the other thing that we need to do is we need creativity. We need to start addressing with our legislators how we can be more creative with the funding. All of our systems, all of our resources, all of our programs have been set up with this idea that there is one size that fits all, that the ease of how we implement a program is what's best for people who are experiencing homelessness or who are precariously housed. And at this point, we can't do anything creative, right? If someone has a voucher, that's great. now we have to do something creative to get them to use that voucher. But I think any one of you would talk about your own experience of moving from, being housed by your parents to your own independent housing, and think about all the creative things that needed to happen in the middle of that to get there. Like my own story is I moved out of my family's house into my dorms. And then over the summers, I always got jobs that had housing attached to them. And when I graduated from college, I lived with my sisters for a little bit. And when they got annoying, then I moved in with other roommates. And then all of those things helped me to learn, how do I budget? How do I finance? How much money do I need in order to have housing that is stable for me? How do I make sure that I pick a house in a neighborhood that feels safe and comfortable and yet isn't huge on, about to kick me out? All of those different things. And yet I didn't learn any of those things through a class. I didn't learn any of those things by a case manager. I learned those things by the creative things that were given to me as opportunities. And we need to create those for people who are unhoused right now. So this is my email address and my phone number. I'll also put it in the chat. You are more than welcome to call me, email me, share with me ideas that you might have about how we can move forward housing and homelessness in our state. Thanks.